Ellen Harper, a 75-year-old black female veteran, her hands weathered by a life of sacrifice. In a rundown pawn shop thick with dust and disdain, she places a silver star medal on the counter, a relic of her bravery in Vietnam. But the clerk and customers sneer, mocking her medal as a fake, taunting her as a woman who couldn't possibly be a hero. Their cruel laughter threatens to bury her truth, dismissing a legacy forged in fire. Will their scorn erase her honor, or will an unexpected ally turn the tide? Stay with us to witness a story of courage, reclaimed, a tale that will challenge what you think you know about heroes. Wherever you're watching from, drop a comment below. Join us on a journey you won't forget. The pawnshop door opened with a tired groan, its rusted hinges protesting the intrusion. Ellen Harper stepped inside, her 75 years old, her face lined with more than her years. In her hands, she held a small wooden box, its edges worn smooth with age, its surface etched with faint scratches that spoke of a long journey. The shop was a graveyard of discarded things, shelves sagging under the weight of cracked radios, tarnished clocks, and guitars that hadn't been strummed in decades. The air was heavy, thick with dust and a faint metallic smell. A lone fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, its light flickering, casting uneven shadows across the dirty linoleum floor. Ellen's boots, scuffed but polished, moved quietly as she approached the counter. Behind it sat Jake, a kid in his early 20s, his hoodie slouched over his shoulders, one earbud dangling like a badge of indifference. His eyes stayed glued to his phone, fingers swiping with the careless swagger of someone who'd already checked out for the day. "What's this about?" he mumbled, his voice barely rising above the bulb's hum. Ellen didn't rush to answer. She placed the box on the glass counter, her hands steady, almost ceremonial. With a soft click, she lifted the lid, revealing a silver star medal, its surface dulled by age, its ribbon faded to a ghostly gray. The engraving caught the light. Ellen Harper, 1972. Jake's eyes flicked up, his lips curling into a sneer. "Another old lady with a story to sell." His words were sharp, laced with a contempt that seemed to tighten the air. Before Ellen could speak, a rough voice cut in from the back of the shop. Tony, a broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket, leaned against a pile of outdated DVDs, his grin wide and mocking. "That's gotta be fake, right? What did you do, swipe it from a thrift store?" His laugh was loud, jagged, pulling snickers from others in the shop. A teenager poking at a broken game controller, a woman sifting through pawned earrings. Their amusement bounced off the walls, cold and biting like shards of glass. Ellen stood unmoved, her hands resting lightly on the box. Her gray eyes held a quiet fire, unyielding under the weight of their scorn. She wasn't here to plead or prove herself to a room of strangers who'd already made up their minds. "I'm not here to sell it," she said, her voice low, each syllable deliberate like a stone dropped into still water. "I want to know if it still means anything." Her words landed heavily, a challenge that seemed to catch the room off guard. Jake leaned forward, squinting at the medal as if it were a cheap knockoff. "Means something. Come on, it's just some old junk. Probably not even real." He shrugged, his sneer deepening, and tapped his phone, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. Tony wasn't done. "What's the story?" "Grandma, you gonna tell us you were some kind of war hero?" His voice carried a taunting edge, hungry for the room's approval. The teenager snorted, muttering, "Bet she bought it online." The woman by the earrings didn't laugh, but her glance at Ellen was sharp, tinged with doubt. The shop felt smaller now, its walls pressing in the air, thick with hostility. Ellen's fingers brushed the box's edge, a subtle motion that hinted at a story buried deep, one this room wasn't ready to hear. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shop's faded sign. Inside, the laughter grew bolder, each jab a test of her resolve. She could have left. She could have closed the box, tucked it away, and walked back into the gray daylight. But Ellen Harper didn't move. Something held her there, something stronger than the sting of their words. The metal wasn't just metal. It was a memory, a vow, a piece of a past that refused to fade. And as the mockery swirled, a question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. What truth lay within that scarred wooden box? Jake leaned back, ready to brush her off. Tony cracked his knuckles, his grin daring her to speak. The room was a tinderbox, and Ellen's next words were about to light the fuse. Ellen Harper stood at the pawn shop counter, her hands steady on the scarred wooden box, the silver star metal glinting faintly under the flickering light. Her words still echoed. I want to know if it still means anything. The air crackled with tension, her quiet challenge hanging like smoke in the stale shop. Jake, the young clerk, leaned back, his sneer twisting deeper. Means something. He scoffed, his voice thick with derision. Lady, you're dreaming, if you think anyone cares about that old scrap. His words were a slap meant to sting, and they did. The room seemed to tighten the walls, leaning in as if to amplify his scorn. Tony, the leather-jacketed man by the DVDs, let out a bark of laughter, his broad shoulders shaking. Come on, Grandma. What's the deal? You pick that up at a flea market and think you're a big shot. His grin was wide, predatory, egging on the crowd. The teenager by the game console, a lanky kid with a backward cap, joined in his chuckle, sharp and mean. Yeah, right. Probably stole it from your husband's dresser. The woman sorting earrings glanced up, her lips pursed, not laughing but not defending either. Their voices wove a net of mockery, each jab tighter, sharper, designed to unravel Ellen's resolve. But Ellen didn't crumble. Her gray eyes held steady, cutting through the haze of their disdain. She drew a slow breath, her voice low but unyielding. This medal was earned, she said, each word deliberate like a blade finding its mark. Earned for saving lives in a war you can't even imagine. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that made the bulb's buzz seem louder, the air heavier. Jake's smirk faltered for a split second, caught off guard by her calm defiance. Then he recovered, rolling his eyes. Saving lives, what were you, knitting bandages or something? His sarcasm dripped, and the room erupted again, Tony's laugh leading the charge. The mockery wasn't just about the medal now. It was about her, a woman. An old woman daring to claim a piece of valor they couldn't fathom. Tony stepped closer, his boots scuffing the linoleum, his voice dropping to a taunting drawl. Let me guess you were some secretary in the army, right? Typed a few letters, got a shiny pin for it? The teenager snickered, muttering, bet she made it up for attention. The woman by the earrings shifted her fingers, pausing, but she said nothing, her silence a kind of complicity. The shop was a crucible, and Ellen was the one being tested, her every word weighed against their disbelief. Ellen's fingers tightened on the box, the wood creaking faintly under her grip. She could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the assumption that a woman like her couldn't carry a story worth hearing. I was a combat medic, she said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. I pulled men out of a burning outpost under fire in '72. The truth landed like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of silence through the room. For a moment the laughter stopped, the air still. Jake blinked, his phone forgotten in his hand. Tony's grin froze, his bravado flickering. But the moment didn't last. Jake shook his head, his sneer snapping back into place. Yeah, sure. A Lady Rambo, huh? Sell that story somewhere else? His words reignited the crowd, and Tony jumped in louder now. What's next? You gonna say you took out a whole platoon single-handed? The teenager cackled, slapping the counter. She probably needs cash for bingo night. The laughter swelled, a wave crashing over Ellen, threatening to drown her quiet truth. She stood there, the box her anchor, her face unreadable but her eyes burning with something fierce, something unbreakable. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shop's loose windows. Inside, the taunts grew bolder, each one a challenge to Ellen's dignity, her womanhood, her past. She could have walked away, let their ignorance bury her story. But she didn't. "It's not about me," she said, her voice steady as steel. "It's about what this medal stands for." Her words were a spark, daring the room to listen. Jake leaned forward, ready to fire back. Tony opened his mouth, his next jab on his tongue. But before they could strike, the door behind Ellen creaked open, a sharp sound that sliced through the laughter like a warning shot. Ellen Harper stood at the pawn shop counter, her hands steady on the scarred wooden box, the Silver Star medal glinting faintly under the flickering light. Her words still echoed. "I want to know if it still means anything." The air crackled with tension, her quiet challenge hanging like smoke in the stale shop. Jake, the young clerk, leaned back, his sneer twisting deeper. "Means something," he scoffed, his voice thick with derision. "Lady, you're dreaming if you think anyone cares about that old scrap." His words were a slap, meant to sting, and they did. The room seemed to tighten the walls, leaning in as if to amplify his scorn. Tony, the leather-jacketed man by the DVDs, let out a bark of laughter, his broad shoulders shaking. "Come on, Grandma, what's the deal? You pick that up at a flea market and think you're a big shot?" His grin was wide, predatory, egging on the crowd. The teenager by the game console, a lanky kid with a backward cap, joined in his chuckle. Sharp and mean. "Yeah, right. Probably stole it from your husband's dresser." The woman sorting earrings glanced up, her lips pursed, not laughing but not defending either. Their voices wove a net of mockery, each jab tighter, sharper, designed to unravel Ellen's resolve. But Ellen didn't crumble. Her gray eyes held steady, cutting through the haze of their disdain. She drew a slow breath, her voice low but unyielding. This medal was earned. She said each word deliberate, like a blade finding its mark. Earned for saving lives in a war you can't even imagine. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that made the bulb's buzz seem louder, the air heavier. Jake's smirk faltered for a split second, caught off guard by her calm defiance. Then he recovered, rolling his eyes. "Saving lives. What were you, knitting bandages or something?" His sarcasm dripped, and the room erupted again, Tony's laugh leading the charge. The mockery wasn't just about the medal now. It was about her. A woman. An old woman daring to claim a piece of valor they couldn't fathom. Tony stepped closer, his boots scuffing the linoleum, his voice dropping to a taunting drawl. "Let me guess, you were some secretary in the army, right? Typed a few letters, got a shiny pin for it." The teenager snickered, muttering. "Bet she made it up for attention." The woman by the earrings shifted her fingers, pausing, but she said nothing, her silence a kind of complicity. The shop was a crucible, and Ellen was the one being tested, her every word weighed against their disbelief. Ellen's fingers tightened on the box, the wood creaking faintly under her grip. She could feel the eyes on her, the judgment, the assumption that a woman like her couldn't carry a story worth hearing. "I was a combat medic," she said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. "I pulled men out of a burning outpost under fire. In '72. The truth landed like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of silence through the room. For a moment the laughter stopped, the air still. Jake blinked, his phone forgotten in his hand. Tony's grin froze, his bravado flickering. But the moment didn't last. Jake shook his head, his sneer snapping back into place. "Yeah, sure. A Lady Rambo, huh? Sell that story somewhere else?" His words reignited the crowd, and Tony jumped in louder. "Now, what's next? You gonna say you took out a whole platoon, single-handed?" The teenager cackled, slapping the counter. "She probably needs cash for bingo night." The laughter swelled, a wave crashing over Ellen, threatening to drown her quiet truth. She stood there, the box her anchor, her face unreadable, but her eyes burning with something fierce, something unbreakable. Outside the wind howled, rattling the shop's loose windows. Inside, the taunts grew bolder, each one a challenge to Ellen's dignity, her womanhood, her past. She could have walked away, let their ignorance bury her story. But she didn't. "It's not about me," she said, her voice steady as steel. "It's about what this medal stands for." Her words were a spark, daring the room to listen. Jake leaned forward, ready to fire back. Tony opened his mouth, his next jab on his tongue. But before they could strike the door behind, Ellen creaked open a sharp sound that sliced through the laughter like a warning shot. Ryan Carter stood at the pawnshop counter, the Silver Star medal resting in its wooden box, his salute still reverberating in the stunned silence. Ellen Harper faced him, her gray eyes steady a quiet strength anchoring her against the fading echoes of mockery. Jake the clerk clutched his phone. His earlier smirk erased his fingers frozen mid-swipe. Tony the leather-jacketed loudmouth shifted uneasily, his boots scraping the linoleum, his bravado reduced to a flicker. The teenager by the game console stood rigid, his cap askew. His hands empty of jest, the woman by the earrings watched her breath shallow, a ring forgotten in her palm. The shop was a held breath waiting for what came next. Ryan's gaze moved from Ellen to the medal, his calloused fingers brushing its edge with care. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, cutting through the quiet like a blade through fog. "This is no trinket," he said each word, deliberate, carrying the weight of battles etched into his bones. He turned to the room, his eyes sweeping over Jake, Tony, the teenager pinning them where they stood. "This is a Silver Star, awarded to Ellen Harper in 1972 for saving 6 soldiers in a burning outpost in Vietnam, under enemy fire." His words landed like a grenade, the truth exploding across the counter, shattering the room's fragile pretense. Jake's jaw dropped, his phone slipping to the counter with a soft clatter. Tony's face reddened, his hands shoving into his pockets, as if to hide from the accusation in Ryan's stare. The teenager blinked rapidly, his mouth half-open, words failing him. The woman's fingers tightened around the ring, her eyes darting to Ellen, searching for confirmation. Ellen stood unmoved, her hands resting on the box, her face a mask of calm. But her eyes betrayed a flicker of memory, a shadow of that long-ago night when fire and blood had defined her. Ryan's voice rose not loud, but commanding, each syllable a hammer striking steel. "I studied her mission in training. She ran through a hail of bullets, dragged 6 men to safety, and kept them alive until dawn." The room seemed to shrink, the weight of his words pressing against every surface. Jake's throat bobbed his earlier taunts, Lady Rambo bingo night, now ash in his mouth. Tony's shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor, his knuckles white inside his pockets. The teenager's hands twitched as if grasping for something to say, but silence held him fast. The woman let out a shaky breath. Her eyes locked on Ellen. A newfound respect dawning Ryan's stare returned to the medal, his fingers tracing the engraving Ellen Harper, 1972, as if reading a sacred text. "This medal," he said, his voice softer now, "cost more than you can imagine. It's not about money, it's about lives saved, promises kept." Ellen's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Her hands tightened briefly on the box, a subtle motion that spoke of burdens carried too long. She hadn't come here for praise, hadn't come to relive that night. But Ryan's words, his recognition stirred something deep, a crack in the armor she'd worn for decades. The shop was no longer a battlefield of jeers. It was a witness to truth, forced to reckon with its own ignorance. Jake's fingers fumbled with his hoodie, his eyes avoiding Ellen's shame creeping into his stance. Tony coughed, a weak sound, his earlier swagger gone. The teenager shifted his cap, pulled lower as if to hide from the moment Ryan set the medal back in the box, his movements precise, reverent. He looked at Ellen, his nod small but heavy with meaning, a soldier's acknowledgement of another's fight. "You don't need their approval. he said, his voice firm, addressing her, but speaking to the room. "But they need to know what you did." The words hung there, a challenge, a verdict. The shop's silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the counter under Jake's trembling hands. Outside, the wind moaned a distant echo of the past. Inside, the truth stood tall, unyielding, demanding to be seen. Ellen's eyes met Ryan's, a silent exchange of understanding of battles fought in different times, but with the same heart. The room watched, caught in the gravity of the moment, their laughter a distant memory. Jake's breath hitched, his fingers curling into fists. Tony's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with something like regret. The teenager stood still, his bravado stripped away. The woman's hand opened the ring, falling softly to the counter. And as Ryan stepped back, his presence still commanding the shop, braced for what he would say next, knowing it would cut deeper than any blade. The pawn shop stood frozen, Ryan Carter's words still ringing in the air, his nod to Ellen Harper, a silent testament to her valor. The Silver Star medal lay in its wooden box, a quiet sentinel on the counter, its presence undeniable. Jake the clerk gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles pale, his earlier bravado reduced to a stammering silence. Tony, the man in the leather jacket, stared at his boots, his hands buried deep in his pockets as if they could shield him from the truth. The teenager by the game console shifted awkwardly, his cap pulled low, his fingers twitching with unease. The woman by the earrings stood still, her gaze fixed on Ellen, a ring forgotten in her hand. The shop was a crucible, its air thick with the weight of reckoning. Ryan's eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Jake. "You think honor's a joke?" He set his voice low, each word a measured strike like a hammer on iron. "This medal is soaked in the blood of those who didn't come home." He paused, letting the words settle his gaze, never wavering. Jake's breath hitched, his eyes darting to the floor, unable to meet the intensity of Ryan's stare. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the faint creak of Tony's boots as he shifted his jaw tight, his earlier taunts, now a distant echo. Ryan's voice softened, but its edge remained, honed by years of carrying burdens too heavy for words. "In Afghanistan, I watched a friend take a bullet to save me." He said, his words slow, deliberate, each one a memory pulled from the dark. He didn't ask for a medal. He didn't ask for thanks. He just did what was right. His eyes flicked to Ellen, a brief glance that carried a soldier's respect. Ellen Harper did the same. She ran through fire bullets snapping past her to save 6 men. "And you?" His gaze swept back to Jake. Then Tony. Then the teenager. "You stand here laughing like her sacrifice is a punchline." Jake's hands trembled, his fingers fumbling with a stray receipt, his face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth a weak, "I didn't mean," escaping before his voice faltered, swallowed by the weight of Ryan's words. Tony's shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on a crack in the linoleum, his earlier swagger replaced by a restless discomfort. The teenager's hands shoved into his pockets, his cap shielding his face, as if he could hide from the lesson unfolding. The woman's fingers tightened around the ring, her breath uneven, her silence no longer neutral but heavy with realization. Ryan stepped closer to the counter, his boots steady, his presence filling the room. "Ellen doesn't need your approval," he said, his voice firm, each word a challenge to their ignorance. "She's carried this medal, this truth, for 50 years, but you—" He pointed at Jake, his finger steady, unwavering. "You owe her respect. You owe her the decency to listen." His words were not a shout, but a command rooted in a conviction that made the shop feel small, its clutter of pawned goods insignificant against the magnitude of what stood before them. Ellen remained still, her hands resting on the box, her face calm, but her eyes alive with something raw, something stirred by Ryan's defense. She hadn't asked for this. hadn't come to demand their awe, yet his words, his unflinching stand, seemed to lift a weight she'd carried alone for too long. The shop was no longer a place of mockery. It was a courtroom, and Ryan was the judge holding a mirror to their shame. Jake's eyes flicked to Ellen, then away his throat, working as if struggling to find words that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. Tony's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists, his silence a grudging admission of guilt. The woman by the earrings let out a soft sigh, her hand opening the ring, slipping to the counter with a faint clink. The teenager's shoulders hunched his cap now, a shield against the truth. He couldn't unhear. Ryan's gaze softened, but only slightly, as he looked at Ellen once more. "Some debts can't be paid," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper but no less powerful. "But they can be honored." He stepped back, his boots scuffing softly, his presence still a force, a reminder that some truths demand more than silence. The shop was a sea of quiet shame, the laughter long gone, replaced by a stillness that pressed against every heart. Jake's hands fell to his sides, his receipt forgotten, his eyes darting between Ellen and the metal. Tony's boots stopped shifting his gaze, lifting hesitant toward the counter. The teenager stood frozen, his cap no longer enough to hide his unease. The woman's eyes lingered on Ellen, a question forming in her gaze, unspoken but heavy. And as the silence stretched, a new weight settled over the room, one born of truth and the cost of ignoring it. The pawnshop stood hushed, Ryan Carter's words a fading thunder, leaving a silence heavy with shame and truth. Ellen Harper's hands rested on the wooden box, the Silver Star medal, a quiet witness to the reckoning that had unfolded. Jake's eyes darted. Tony's boots stilled. The teenager's cap hid his face, and the woman's gaze lingered, all caught in the weight of what they'd heard. The counter between them was a divide, separating Ellen's unyielding presence from a room grappling with its own ignorance. But for Ellen, the moment wasn't about their guilt. It was a doorway to a night-long buried a night that had carved her soul and left scars no one could see. Her mind slipped back to 1972, to a jungle outpost in Vietnam, where the air was thick with the acrid sting of smoke. Ellen, 24, a combat medic, moved through the chaos of a night attack, her boots sinking into mud churned by panic and blood. The sky was a furnace lit by flares and the orange glow of explosions. Mortar shells screamed, tearing earth and flesh, their roars drowning out the shouts of soldiers scrambling for cover. Her medic's bag slapped against her hip, its weight a lifeline as she ran toward the heart of the inferno, where a burning bunker trapped 6 men. The heat was a living thing clawing at her skin, singeing her hair as she reached the bunker's entrance. Flames licked the wooden beams, spitting embers that stung like hornets. Inside voices cried out, hoarse, desperate, pleading for a chance to live. Ellen didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, crawling through a haze of smoke so dense it choked her lungs. Her hands found the first man. His leg shattered, his face slick with sweat and fear. She dragged him out, her muscles, screaming bullets snapping past her like angry wasps. The ground shook, another shell landing too close. But she went back. 5 more times she returned, each trip a gamble with death. The second man clung to her, his arm burned raw, his gasps ragged. The third was unconscious, his weight dead in her arms, but she hauled him through the mud. The fourth and fifth fought to help, their strength fading, their eyes wide with trust in her. The sixth was Katie Miller, a young soldier barely 19, her uniform torn, her face pale under a mask of soot. Katie's hand gripped Ellen's, her voice a broken whisper. "Don't let them forget," she said, her eyes fierce. Despite the blood pooling beneath her, Ellen pulled her free, but Katie's grip slackened, her breath fading as medics swarmed in. Dawn broke over the outpost, gray and merciless, revealing a field of wreckage and loss. Ellen knelt in the mud, her hands stained red, her uniform soaked through. Katie was gone, her words a haunting echo in the quiet. The other 5 lived their names etched in Ellen's memory. But it was Katie's face. She saw her fierce eyes, her fleeting dream of writing poetry, her courage in a war that didn't care. 3 weeks later, in a stark ceremony, a colonel pinned the Silver Star to Ellen's chest. She stood rigid, the metal cold against her skin, her thoughts not on glory, but on the girl who'd never go home. That night had reshaped her, not with pride, but with a weight she carried in silence. The medal wasn't a badge of heroism. It was a reminder of those she couldn't save, of Katie's final plea, of a world that moved on while she stayed tethered to that burning outpost. Ellen's fingers brushed the box, now the wood warm under her touch, as if it held the heat of that night. She hadn't spoken of it in decades, hadn't needed to. But Ryan's stand, his unflinching truth, had cracked open a door she'd kept locked, letting the memories flood back. The pawn shop was a world away from that jungle, its clutter of pawned lives a pale shadow of the stakes she'd faced. Yet the scorn she'd met here, the dismissal of her sacrifice, echoed the indifference she'd fought against. Then, her eyes gray and steady held a quiet fire, not for herself, but for Katie, for the others, for the truth that deserved to stand. The shop's silence was her battlefield now, and she stood as she had then, unbowed, resolute, carrying a promise that refused to fade. Jake's hands twitched, Tony's gaze flickered, the teenager's cap dipped lower, and the woman's breath caught, all sensing the depth of what lay unspoken. Ellen's past was a shadow cast across the counter, its weight undeniable, and as she stood there, the box her anchor, the question lingered heavy and urgent. Would the world ever truly honor the sacrifices she'd made? The pawn shop's silence lingered. Ellen Harper's presence a quiet force. The wooden box on the counter a testament to a night that had defined her. The weight of her past hung heavy, a shadow cast across the room, leaving Jake Tony the teenager, and the woman grappling with their own reflections. Ellen's gray eyes held steady, her hands still on the box, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting to the years that followed that fiery night in 1972. The shop, with its clutter of discarded lives, was a stark contrast to the life she'd chosen, or perhaps the one forced upon her, a life of solitude, shaped by whispers and walls built by others' doubts. After the war, Ellen settled in a quiet suburb, a small house on a street lined with sycamores, its paint peeling under the weight of time. She kept the Silver Star hidden, locked in its wooden box, tucked inside a drawer beneath folded linens. The medal wasn't a trophy to display, not a story to share over coffee with neighbors. It was a private vow, a tether to those she'd saved, and the one she couldn't. Her days were simple, tending a modest garden, reading by a cracked window, walking to the corner store for bread and milk. But simplicity masked a deeper isolation, one carved by the world's refusal to see her as more than an anomaly. Neighbors nodded politely, their smiles thin, their eyes curious but guarded. They called her that odd old lady, their voices low as if her quietness was a puzzle to be solved. At block parties, they'd murmur over potato salad and lemonade, their words sharp with assumption. A woman in the war, what could she have done, really? Typed letters, made sandwiches. Their laughter was soft, but it cut deep, each word a reminder that her truth didn't fit their tidy narratives. Ellen overheard her hands steady as she poured tea, her face unreadable. She never corrected them. Never spoke of the mud, the blood, the screams. To explain would be to cheapen it, to turn a sacred memory into gossip. The world had moved on its wars, fading into history books, its heroes framed in black and white photos. But for Ellen, the war never ended. It lived in the ache of her shoulders, the catch in her breath on humid nights, the way her hands still reached for a medic's bag that wasn't there. the prejudice wasn't just in the neighbors' whispers. It was in the job interviews where men smirked at her service record in the veterans' halls, where eyes skipped over her in the parade invitations that never came. Women don't fight, they'd say, or think their silence louder than words. Ellen learned to walk past her head high, but each slight built another layer around her heart. She wasn't bitter, but she was alone. Friends from the war had scattered, some lost to time, others to wounds that never healed. Family was distant, their letters sparse, their questions about her service, polite but shallow. Ellen didn't blame them. How could they understand a night that still woke her at 3 a.m.? Katie Miller's voice echoing, "Don't let them forget." The medal locked away was her only witness, its weight a reminder of promises kept in silence. She polished the box sometimes, her fingers tracing its scratches, each one a map of years spent carrying a truth no one asked for. The suburbs' rhythms flowed around her children, biking past dogs, barking at dusk porch lights flickering on. Ellen was part of it. But apart from it, her life a quiet rebellion against the world's dismissal. She'd sit on her porch, a book unopened in her lap, watching the sky shift from gold to gray. Her thoughts drifting to those she'd pulled from the fire, to Katie's fierce eyes, to the lives that went on, because she hadn't faltered. The neighbors' whispers didn't matter. Then they couldn't touch what she carried, couldn't dim the fire that still burned within her. Yet the isolation was real, a weight as heavy as the medal itself. Ellen didn't seek pity, didn't crave their understanding. But the solitude built brick by brick from their doubts was a battle she fought alone. She'd walk to the store, her steps measured, her eyes catching the glances, curious, dismissive, sometimes kind, but never knowing. And she'd return to her house, the box waiting its contents, a silent vow to those who'd trusted her in the dark. The world might forget, but Ellen Harper would not. Her life was a testament, not to glory but to duty, to a promise made in blood and fire. And as she stood in the pawn shop, now the box under her hands, she was still that medic, still that soldier, still the woman who'd run through hell for others. The room watched, its silence a fragile bridge between her past and their present, a question unanswered. Would they ever see her as she truly was? The pawnshop's silence was a fragile thread. Ellen Harper's unwavering presence anchoring the moment the wooden box on the counter, a silent vow from a life shaped by sacrifice. The weight of her solitary years lingered in her steady gaze, a testament to a truth she carried alone. Jake's hands twitched, Tony's eyes flickered, the teenager's cap dipped, and the woman's breath caught, each wrestling with the echo of their own misjudgments. Ellen stood apart, her thoughts drifting beyond the shop's cluttered walls to a ritual that had sustained her through decades of solitude, a private act of remembrance that kept a promise alive. Every November, when the air turned crisp and the leaves fell like faded memories, Ellen walked to a small park at the edge of town. The park was unremarkable, a patch of grass framed by aging oaks, a playground creaking in the breeze, a single wooden bench worn smooth by time. She'd sit there alone, her coat buttoned against the chill, her hands folded in her lap. No one noticed her, not the joggers passing by, not the mothers pushing strollers, not the kids chasing stray soccer balls. To them she was just an old woman, a fixture as ordinary as the bench itself. But for Ellen, this was sacred ground, a place where the past reached out and held her close. She'd close her eyes, the wind brushing her face, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. And then in a whisper so soft, it barely stirred the air, she'd say a single word. Katie. The name of the young soldier, the poet who never was the girl whose final words had burned into Ellen's soul. Katie Miller, with her fierce eyes and fleeting dreams, had asked for one thing in that burning outpost to be remembered, Ellen had kept that promise year after year, speaking her name to the wind, letting it carry the vow forward, a thread unbroken by time or indifference. The ritual was simple, but its weight was immense. It was Ellen's light in the darkness of her isolation, a moment when the world's dismissal faded, and she was once again the medic who'd fought through fire. But it was also a burden, a reminder of the cost she'd paid, of the lives she'd saved, and the one she couldn't. Katie's name was a prayer, a plea, a pledge that no one else would share. She didn't need an audience, didn't want one. The wind was enough, its restless voice a witness to her fidelity, its gusts sweeping her words into the unknown. Among years the sky was clear, the sun painting the leaves gold. Others rain fell in cold sheets soaking her coat, or snow dusted the bench chilling her bones. But Ellen always came, her steps steady, her purpose unshaken. She'd sit sometimes for hours, her breath visible in the November air, her mind replaying moments from that night, Katie's hand in hers, the heat of the flames, the weight of a promise made in chaos. The park was her sanctuary, the bench her altar, the name her offering. It was where she honored not just Katie, but all of them, the ones who'd trusted her to bring them home. The townsfolk passed by their lives a blur of errands and chatter, unaware of the ceremony unfolding in their midst. They didn't see the woman who'd carried a medal's weight for 50 years, who'd fought a war and its aftermath with quiet resolve. Ellen didn't mind their ignorance. This wasn't for them. It was for Katie, for the poet's dreams cut short, for the courage that deserved to live on. She'd leave the bench as she came alone, her coat damp, her heart both heavier and lighter, the wind carrying her whisper into the ether. Back in the pawn shop, Ellen's fingers rested on the box, the wood a link to those November days. The ritual had kept her whole, a thread of purpose in a life shadowed by prejudice. She hadn't come here to share it, hadn't expected the shop's crude stage to stir those memories. Yet standing here under the gaze of strangers who'd begun to see her, she felt the echo of that bench, that name, that vow. The room was still, its occupants caught in the gravity of her silence, unaware of the sacred act that defined her. Jake's hands lay limp. Tony's jaw was set. The teenager's cap shielded his eyes, and the woman's gaze softened, each sensing a depth they couldn't name. Ellen's ritual was hers alone, but its truth cast a light across the counter, a challenge to a world that forgot too easily. And as she stood there, the box her anchor, a new presence, was about to cross her path, a young gaze that would see what others missed. Part 9. An Unexpected Encounter. The Girl and the Letter. The pawnshop's quiet held firm. Ellen Harper's presence a steady beacon, the wooden box on the counter a silent link to her November ritual. The air was thick with unspoken truths, Jake's hands still. Tony's gaze averted, the teenager's cap low, and the woman's eyes searching, each caught in the wake of Ellen's unspoken story. Her thoughts lingered on the park bench, on the name she whispered to the wind, a vow that had sustained her through years of solitude. But that bench, that sacred space, had once been touched by another soul, a moment that stirred her heart, and now echoed in the shop's stillness, a memory of a connection forged in shared loss. It was a cold November morning, the park draped in mist, the oaks bare against a slate-gray sky. Ellen sat on her bench, her coat drawn tight, her hands folded, the familiar weight of her ritual settling over her. She'd just whispered Katie's name, the word carried away by a gust that rustled the fallen leaves. The park was quiet, the swings empty, the distant hum of traffic, a faint murmur. She expected no one, wanted no one. This was her time, her promise, her solitude. But then a soft crunch of gravel broke the silence, and she sensed a presence, a shadow pausing at the edge of her vision, Lily Adams, 15, stood 10 feet away, a slight figure in a worn jacket, a camera dangling from her neck. Her sneakers were scuffed, her backpack slung low but her eyes clear. Unguarded met Ellen's with a curiosity that wasn't intrusive. Ellen expected her to move on to snap a photo of the fog or chase some fleeting moment with her lens. But Lily didn't. She hesitated, then walked closer. Her steps tentative as if drawn by something she couldn't name. Without a word, she sat on the far end of the bench, her legs swinging gently, her camera resting in her lap. The silence between them was easy, not forced, like two travelers meeting on a long road. Ellen didn't speak, didn't need to. She sensed a weight in Lily, a quiet that mirrored her own. Minutes passed, the wind weaving through the oaks, carrying the faint creak of a distant swing. Then Lily turned, her voice soft, almost lost in the breeze. "My sister was a soldier." She said, her words simple but heavy, each one a stone dropped into still water. She didn't come back. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, but her hands tightened on the camera, a small tremor betraying the pain she carried. Ellen's breath caught, not in surprise but in recognition, a shared wound that needed no explanation. Lily reached into her backpack, her movements careful as if handling something fragile. She pulled out a small notebook, its leather cover worn, pages crinkled from use. She flipped through sketches, poems, and pressed flowers until she found a folded scrap of paper torn from a letter. She held it out, her hand steady despite the chill. Ellen took it, her fingers brushing the worn edges, and unfolded it. The handwriting was bold, scrawled in haste. "Don't let the world make you forget. No signature, no date, just a command, a plea, a sister's final wish." Ellen's throat tightened, the words echoing Katie's dying whisper, a call to remembrance that crossed decades. They sat in silence, the letter between them, a bridge over the years that separated their losses. Lily didn't cry, didn't fidget, just sat, her gaze fixed on the oaks, her presence a quiet strength. Ellen didn't offer words of comfort, none were needed. Their shared stillness was enough, a communion of grief that felt like standing shoulder to shoulder on a battlefield no one else could see. The wind stirred again, lifting the letter's edge, as if urging it to speak. Ellen folded it carefully, returning it to Lily, her nod small but heavy, a soldier's acknowledgement of another's fight. Back in the pawn shop. Ellen's hands rested on the box, the memory of that morning sharp in her mind. Lily's eyes, her letter. Her quiet courage had been a light in Ellen's solitude, a reminder that some promises outlive their makers. She hadn't expected to find kinship on that bench, hadn't sought it, but Lily's presence had shifted something, a crack in the walls she'd built. The shop's occupants watched, unaware of the encounter that had touched her, their silence a canvas for the truth she carried. Lily's notebook lay closed now, but her words, her sister's words, lingered in Ellen's heart, a new vow woven into the old. The pawn shop was a world away from that misty park, but the connection forged there held firm, a thread of hope in a life of quiet battles. And as Ellen stood the box, her anchor, she couldn't know that Lily's small act was about to ripple outward, shaking the town to its core. The pawnshop's stillness held Ellen Harper like a quiet embrace, the wooden box on the counter a steadfast reminder of her unspoken vows. The memory of Lily Adams, the girl with the camera and the letter, lingered in her heart, a moment of connection that had pierced her solitude. Jake's hands lay idle. Tony's gaze wandered the teenager's cap, shadowed his eyes, and the woman's fingers twitched, each caught in the gravity of Ellen's presence. The shop's cluttered shelves stood witness, but Ellen's thoughts drifted to a November morning when a single act had sparked a fire, a moment that had reached far beyond the park bench, and now echoed in the silence around her. It had been a fleeting impulse for Lily sitting beside Ellen on that weathered bench, the mist curling around the oaks. As Ellen rose to leave her coat brushing the wood, Lily lifted her camera, its lens catching the morning light. She framed Ellen's silhouette, head-bowed hands folded, the weight of years etched in her posture. The shutter clicked soft but deliberate, capturing a truth Lily felt but couldn't name. That night in her attic room, Lily posted the photo online, her fingers hesitating before typing a caption, "Honor doesn't die." No hashtags, no embellishments, just 4 words that carried a quiet power, a call sent into the digital void. The photo spread like wildfire by dawn. It had been shared dozens of times, then hundreds, then thousands, its reach far beyond the small town. People didn't react with fleeting likes or empty emojis. They responded with stories raw and unfiltered, pouring out in comments and reposts. A woman shared a faded letter from her aunt, a nurse in Korea never honored. A man posted a photo of his mother's dog tags, her service dismissed as clerical work. Daughters, sons, grandchildren typed names, dates, sacrifices, women soldiers whose courage had been buried under dust and doubt. The photo became a mirror reflecting a truth the world had overlooked. The town once indifferent stirred. For years, Ellen had been a shadow, a figure they passed without a second glance. Now her image on their screens demanded attention. Her story, a spark that ignited a collective awakening. It began with a single gesture. A librarian, her glasses fogged with emotion, carried a folding chair to the park and sat beside the bench, a candle flickering in her hand. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was a statement, a quiet apology for years of oversight. By noon, others followed, drawn by an urge they couldn't explain, their steps, hesitant but resolute. A mail carrier still in uniform arrived with a sealed envelope. "Thank you" scrawled in pencil across the front. He placed it at the bench's base, his hands trembling. A barista from the corner cafe brought a thermos of coffee, setting it down, like an offering, her eyes red from reading the stories online. A retired teacher came with a small flag, its edges frayed, and stood silently, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. Teenagers' phones tucked away gathered in a loose circle, their usual chatter replaced by a reverence they hadn't known they possessed. The bench once, Ellen's alone, became a gathering place, a shrine to truths too long ignored. They brought tokens of their own letters, photos, medals pulled from attic boxes, each one a story of a woman who'd served, fought, and faded from memory. A construction worker, his hands rough from labor, laid down a bronze star, his grandmother's, its ribbon faded but unbroken. A nurse pinned a handwritten note, her mother's name inked in careful script. The grass around the bench grew crowded, a tapestry of remembrance woven from grief and gratitude. Someone nobody knew who erected a wooden plaque, its words carved deep. "This place honors them." It stood firm, a marker of a shift that felt both sudden and inevitable. Ellen hadn't seen, the photo hadn't known her. Moment of solitude had become a beacon. But as she stood in the pawn shop, the box under her hands, she felt a faint echo of that morning, of Lily's quiet courage, of a world beginning to listen. The shop's silence was a bridge to that park, to the bench, now surrounded by strangers who'd claimed her story as their own. She wasn't alone anymore, though she couldn't yet grasp the scale of what had begun. The town had woken, its heart stirred by a single image, a single truth. Jake's fingers curled. Tony's jaw tightened. The teenager's cap lifted slightly, and the woman's eyes glistened, each sensing a shift they couldn't name. The pawnshop was a small stage, but the story unfolding beyond its walls was vast, a movement born of one girl's lens and one woman's resolve. And as Ellen stood the box, her anchor, the question hung heavy. Would this awakening endure when she was gone? The pawnshop's air was still Ellen Harper's presence. A quiet flame, the wooden box on the counter, a tether to a movement that had swept beyond its walls. The echo of Lily's photo, the town's awakening, lingered in her steady gaze, a testament to a truth that had found its voice. Jake's fingers stilled. Tony's shoulders eased the teenager's cap, tilted up, and the woman's eyes softened, each touched by a story they hadn't fully grasped. Ellen stood resolute, unaware of the bench now crowded with tributes, her heart anchored to a promise kept through decades. But time moves on, and a year later her story would find its final chapter, not in the shop's dim light, but in a legacy that outlived her. Ellen passed quietly in her small suburban home. A year after that November morning, her departure, as unassuming as her life. No fanfare marked her going, no headlines heralded her loss. She slipped away in the night, her breath fading under a quilt worn thin by years. The wooden box resting on a bedside table, its lid closed but its weight eternal. In a drawer beneath a stack of yellowed letters, she left a single page, her handwriting steady despite her failing strength. The words were simple, direct, a final command. Keep Katie's name alive and all those like her. It was her will. Her wish, her last act of fidelity to a vow made in fire. The town learned of her passing days later, a quiet ripple in a place forever changed by her story. Lily Adams, now 16, felt the news like a stone in her chest. She hadn't seen Ellen since that misty park morning, but the letter, the bench, the shared silence had bound them. On November 6th, a year to the day since the photo that shook the town, Lily returned to the park. In her arms she carried a folded flag, one Ellen had kept in her closet, its edges frayed, but its stars bright. It had been entrusted to Lily by a neighbor, a silent request Ellen had never voiced, but somehow intended. The park was different now, the bench no longer solitary. The wooden plaque. This place honors them stood firm, surrounded by tokens left in Ellen's wake, candles burned to stubs, letters sealed in plastic medals glinting in the autumn sun. Lily approached her sneakers soft on the grass, her camera left at home, her hands reverent. She placed the flag on the bench, its folds precise, a soldier's care in every crease. The town gathered, not summoned by notifications or trending posts, but by a deeper call, a recognition of what Ellen had meant, what she'd stood for. They came in quiet waves, their steps a pilgrimage. The librarian sat on her folding chair, a book of war poetry in her lap. Her candle relit. The mail carrier stood nearby, his cap in hand, a new envelope tucked beside the plaque. The barista poured coffee from a thermos, her hands steady despite the chill. A veteran, his cane tapping softly, brought a single dog tag, its chain clinking as he set it down. Families, teenagers, retirees, all stood together, their faces solemn, their silence a chorus of respect. They weren't here for likes or shares. They were here because Ellen's life, her truth, had taught them to see what they'd once ignored. Lily knelt beside the bench, her fingers tracing the flag's hem. She unfolded it once, then again, letting its colors catch the light, a brief unfurling of Ellen's spirit. Then, with slow, deliberate care, she began to fold it back, each crease, sharp each motion. A prayer. The crowd watched, their breaths visible in the crisp air, their hands still. Lily's hands didn't tremble, though her heart did each fold a tribute to Ellen, to Katie, to every woman whose courage had been forgotten. The final tuck was perfect. The flag, a tight triangle, a promise sealed against time. She placed it on the bench, her hand lingering as if to anchor Ellen's memory to the wood. The crowd stirred, a soft murmur rising, not of grief, but of resolve. They understood now not just Ellen's sacrifice, but the duty to carry it forward. The librarian whispered a poem's line, the veteran saluted, the barista wiped her eyes. Lily stood her gaze sweeping the faces around her, seeing in them a commitment that would outlast this day. Ellen was gone, but her legacy was alive, woven into the town's heart, a flame that wouldn't fade. Back in the pawn shop. Ellen's hands rested on the box, the memory of that future unwritten, but somehow felt the shop was a fleeting stage, its occupants unaware of the ripples her life would send. Jake's eyes flickered. Tony's breath steadied the teenager's cap. Rose and the woman's hand opened, each touched by a woman who'd already changed them. And as Ellen stood, her truth unshaken, her story was poised to leave a mark far deeper than any of them could know. The pawnshop's hush was a sacred pause. Ellen Harper's quiet strength, a beacon that had reshaped the room. The wooden box on the counter stood as a silent witness to a legacy that had reached beyond the town. Its echoes felt in the tributes left at a park bench. Jake's eyes were downcast. Tony's hands unclenched, the teenager's cap rested higher, and the woman's gaze held steady, each transformed by a truth they could no longer ignore. Ellen's life, her resolve had planted a seed, and now in the stillness that seed bore fruit, offering a lesson that would linger long after the shop's door closed behind her. Honor, the story whispered, is not a medal pinned to a chest or a name carved in stone. It is not a parade, a headline, or a crowd's applause. It lives in the quiet choices, the acts done when no one watches, the promises kept in the face of indifference. Ellen had carried her truth for decades, not for glory but because it was right. She'd run through fire, held a dying soldier's hand, whispered a name to the wind, all without seeking a spotlight. Her life was a testament to a truth as old as sacrifice. Honor is its own reward, needing no validation, no proof beyond the heart that bears it. This lesson wasn't just for the pawn shop's occupants caught in their moment of reckoning. It was for every listener, every soul who'd ever walked past a story untold. It called them to pause, to look closer, to ask questions they'd never thought to voice. Who in their own lives had served unseen? Whose courage had been dismissed, buried under assumptions or time? The women soldiers like Ellen, like Katie, whose names were rarely spoken. Where were their stories? The question hung heavy, a challenge to dig through family attics, to open old letters, to listen. Before the chance was gone, Ellen's journey from a burning outpost to a solitary bench was a mirror held up to the world. It showed a woman who'd fought not just a war, but the weight of prejudice, the sting of solitude, and still stood tall. Her strength wasn't in the medal, but in the vow she kept, the lives she saved, the memory she guarded. And Lily, the girl with the camera, had carried that strength forward, her photo, a spark that lit a fire of remembrance. Their stories wove together a tapestry of resilience, proof that even the quietest voices can shift the tide when they speak truth. The lesson deepened with every face it touched. For Jake, it was a call to question his snap judgments, to see beyond the surface of those he met. For Tony, it was a nudge to temper his bravado, to honor what he didn't understand. For the teenager, it was a spark of curiosity, a chance to learn the stories behind the relics in his grandmother's drawer. For the woman, it was a resolve to ask her aunt about the war, to hear the truths she'd never shared. And for the listener, it was an invitation to act, to seek out the forgotten, to give voice to those who'd been silenced. This wasn't about guilt, though shame had stirred the pawn shop's air. It was about responsibility, about carrying forward what Ellen had begun. Her life asked for. No monuments, no statues, but for something simpler, harder attention, to notice the quiet heroes, to ask their names, to keep their stories alive. Katie's plea, "Don't let them forget," wasn't just Ellen's burden. It was a mantle passed to all who heard a call to ensure that no sacrifice, no matter how hidden, was lost to time. The satisfaction came not from applause, but from the act of remembering, of making space for truths that deserved to stand. Ellen's legacy was a quiet revolution, one that didn't demand fanfare, but thrived in the small, deliberate choices of those she'd touched. It lived in the questions asked, the stories shared, the candles lit by a bench. It was a reminder that honor doesn't fade, that it waits patient for those willing to see it. The pawnshop with its worn counter and scattered lives was a fleeting stage, but the lesson it held was timeless, a truth that would outlast its walls, its occupants, its moment. The listener felt it a stirring in the chest, a sense of having been part of something larger. They walked away, not just with Ellen's story, but with a charge to look, to listen, to remember. The pawnshop faded, but the call remained a whisper in the heart, urging them to find the Ellens, the Katies, the Lilies in their own lives. And as the story closed, its truth stood firm, a beacon for those who chose to carry it forward, a light that no darkness could dim. The pawnshop's echo faded. Ellen Harper's truth. Now a beacon beyond its walls, her lesson of unseen honor had stirred hearts, urging listeners to seek forgotten stories. The narrative turned to its close, not in the shop, but at a park where a bench stood sacred, where Lily Adams sealed a vow that would live forever. On a crisp November morning, the park glowed with quiet reverence, oaks framing a bench adorned with tributes, letters, medals, candles. Lily 16 stood tall, holding Ellen's cherished flag, its folds tight stars gleaming. The crowd encircled her faces, solemn, drawn by a truth that had awakened them. They weren't here for fleeting fame, but to honor a legacy. Lily stepped onto the bench, her sneakers steady, and raised the flag. Sunlight caught its colors, a burst of red, white, and blue that held the morning's warmth. The gesture was simple, profound, honoring Ellen Katie Miller and countless unsung women. The wind whispered Katie, carrying her name like an eternal vow. The crowd saluted, hands rising in unison, the librarian with her candle, the mail carrier with his envelope, the barista with steady fingers, a veteran with sharp precision. Each salute wove a bond, a pledge to remember. The flag's shadow fell across the plaque. This place honors them, its words carved deep. The teenager from the pawn shop saluted, cap off, eyes clear. The woman who'd held the ring joined her gesture, soft but sure. The moment was a crescendo. Grief and hope entwined, a promise that Ellen's sacrifice would endure. Lily's arms held firm, her heart heavy with Ellen's resolve. Katie's dream. She lowered the flag, placing it on the bench, folds tight, a final embrace of the wood. The crowd exhaled their resolve, unbroken. They'd carry this forward, asking questions, sharing stories, keeping names alive. The wind rose, lifting Katie into the sky, a truth unshaken. Ellen Harper would never be forgotten. Listeners felt it, a weight in their hearts, a spark to act, to find their own Ellen's, Katie's, Lilies. The park softened the bench, a sentinel under the sun. Lily stepped down, her hand brushing the plaque, eyes bright. The crowd lingered, footsteps gentle, the flag's stars catching the light. The story ended, no sequel needed, its image enduring, a girl, a flag, a town united. Honor once seen could never fade, a call to remember etched in every heart. As the November sunlight bathes that park bench, Lily's flag gleams, a testament to Ellen Harper's courage, Katie Miller's dream, and the unsung women who served. This story isn't just theirs. It's a call to find the heroes in our own lives, to uncover the truths we've overlooked, to speak the names that deserve to be heard. Who in your family, your community carries a story waiting to be told? Share their name below. Let their legacy shine. Ellen's life reminds us that honor lives in quiet acts, in remembrance that outlasts time. If this tale stirred your heart, like, share, and subscribe to keep these stories alive. Every voice matters, Every memory counts together. We ensure they're never forgotten, one story at a time.